at that point, we've taken out a number of these bullet points, and really at the moment, the only ones that are untouched are the second one and the last one, which is not much guidance. So do we edit them to be sort of somewhat more broad, that we can flesh them out further, or do we have to go around the kind of a discussion again on
Let me ask, if I could ask Brian a question. When the state promulgates rules, typically there's a fiscal note, there's an attorney review to make sure it's applicable, due to form, legal form. I would expect, because again, we're talking about this, but we all know that the committee isn't going to manage this program. To Josh's point, at what point does the planning department take it back over, work it and review it with the solicitor, and come back and say, yeah, we need another FTE, or other facilities or faculties in order to administer the program, and it would work like this? Because I think we've got a good jumping off point, but it lacks that interface, with town government to actually get implemented.
Yeah, and I think that was part of, Kayla's interest in bringing in Jean Bouchard or some other people to try and assess how much of a workload some of these ideas might be incurring on the department. Because you're right, if you are taking on the job of administering loans, somebody's going to have to shoulder that. Solicitors may have to review paperwork, and all of that. Certainly, part of the process of this going through the town council, it will most definitely go through the solicitor's office, and the town manager will look at this for impacts to staffing. But if we know that ahead of time, we certainly should be raising that question on our own as a board, and trying to find an answer before we throw an idea forward that just isn't workable.
And so, but at least in theory, the idea of securing a grant or first financing or whatever by a lien, and then forgiveness mechanism at closing, these are things that at least in theory are possible, and we just have to throw that to the staff, to the solicitor, to to other folks, and to the town manager to see how to actually do that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard to get grant funding just for a general idea of having money available to service the loan program. People giving money for grants generally want to see a more specific game plan for the money. So if you had identified some specific properties or projects that you thought you could support by doing that, that would be something that you could get some grant funding sources to possibly assist with. But just to say, give me $50,000 so when these things come up, we'll have the money available to do it, that you're not likely to find support for that sort of thing. I mean, even if you said we're going to use the money to target affordable housing in Peacedale or Wakefield or something more specifically directed, that would be more likely to garner support.
But in terms of how, the town's gonna administer this and we're gonna oversee some of this, I guess I wasn't imagining that we as the Affordable Housing Collaborative would be coming up with projects, but rather that, we put this out there and then people would bring uh, projects to the committee. Am I misunderstanding that, or is that?
I think we're talking about two separate things. To the extent that you have an affordable housing trust fund that accumulates money, either by town contributions or fees collected in lieu or donations, you can certainly do that. To the extent that you want to go out and solicit grant funding,
Oh, I
you're
see.
going to have a more specific targeted plan to present to the grantor.
I see.
And I think the original purpose of the rest of this section H, the first paragraph is specific, and that solves some of the things actually we had already started to do. The rest of it was really discussion. It was to support the document that we voted on, that I think has moved forward, regarding the tax abatement program for the accessory dwelling units, because our thought was we're going to try and push that element of it and utilize some of the grant money or some of the money that we have in the fund to help support that. And I think that's where the discussion stuff started to break down a little bit, because it was the how do we do it part of it. If I can make a suggestion, what I would love to do is, and I hate to say it, I don't have a copy of the document that we voted on for the ADUs, the tax abatement program. Can we recirculate that for the next meeting, and if we take a look at that document and think in terms of, okay, if that's part of a mission, part of a small part of the mission, right? The ADU parts, how would we best support that with at least the least amount of town, facilities needed in order to do so? So in other words, is it a grant for plans and specs up to $5,000? Is it a grant for the monitoring? Is it, and it's got to be in small chunks, because as we've seen, you could spend $100,000 on building an accessory dwelling unit. That's not going to come out of the fund, and you're not going to get a loan for it. But in small chunks and grants, it can be helpful, similar to what we do for places like the Welcome House, where we did the chunk of money for them to hire the attorney. It's moving us forward towards the affordable housing goal, and it's in the angle of the accessory dwelling units, which is something we've already voted on and moved along. I'm not sure if it's been in front of the council yet or not. I'm assuming no, because I think
it just went through planning on Tuesday.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. So, can I suggest that for an agenda for next meeting? And Brian sends out that document just as a refresher, so we can take a look at that and think in terms of how can we support that in the best possible way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I can certainly do that.
What would move the other items forward in our discussion if we want to revisit this in our next meeting, and potentially, I don't know if we're going to get to a place where we can vote and put it in front of the council. Is it a matter of taking out some of the language? Is it a matter of, I think your hunch, Christian, is right, that some of these things are going to be more involved conversations.
Yeah, I think we have to think a little bit simpler. And I think this happened the last time around, and we sort of took a step back and said, okay, let's start small, because it turned into us buying properties and rehabbing them. And we're like, okay, let's everyone take a deep breath.
My dream.
Yeah. And let's start small by seeing what the interest is. Let's get something on the books for the tax abatement, maybe provide a little bit of support for plans and specs or what have you, fees. Maybe it's for to go towards permits, and then of course we have to get the word out that this even exists, and see what happens. Do we get a flood of applications? Do we get none? That's really what we're trying to do with the first step.
So I'd like to supplement that and suggest that, again, I think ultimately somebody in the town is going to be at the driver's seat of this program. They're going to be there daily. We're doing a lot of, kind of role playing, trying to understand how this might work. I'd like to hear from Brian and or Rob on, again, the fiscal note, how this would impact staff resources. I think the staff is always going to be perfectly much better suited to administer the type of program, rather than guessing as to what is the smallest chunk that we can take on as a committee. I'd like to hear from the town staff how they they're interpreting this workload is, because it's going to be, my guess is, we want to appeal to the market, and to Christian's point, we don't know the types of applications that are come in, the requests. So we want somebody nimble on their feet, somebody in Brian's office that can help out. Ultimately, I think that's the role of these types of committees. We help formulate and synthesize the concepts, but it does eventually go back to town staff, and we're really in a advisory role after that.
Right.
I would also just add that I think we are trying to do a lot of different approaches, and some of them are smaller and some of them are larger. I mean, we haven't really had a conversation about, there haven't really been any significant affordable housing developments in a while in our town. And that's a whole other thing in terms of how is that financed, how do community development corporations or other, nonprofit housing groups look at being able to do that, and knowing how expensive land is here. There's that other side, which is there room in our town to not only do these things that are infill, but also to try and create some relationships with affordable housing producers beyond developers who are adding the 25% or 20% to their development, but like actually producing some new affordable housing like they did with a lot of the 55 plus not too long ago. And I think maybe La Casa, one of the elderly disabled buildings, is one of the newer ones, but we haven't really had anything that was newer affordable housing development. And we know that Charlestown and Richmond have been able to figure out how to do it. That's something I'd be interested in exploring a little bit, to see, like, are there barriers? Are there reasons that we can't get somebody to come in here? And I mean, even if it's 10 units or 15 units, having some new construction might also be something worth investigating.
And to that point, Jen, that's a great point. In thinking about even this part of it with the ADUs, I think about friends that I have who own small remodeling companies, not the big builders that we often see in the planning, but the smaller guys. And, chat with them about this type of stuff. Maybe part of the grant is to give these guys money to market to existing clients and say, hey, did you know you can get a tax break in taking your garage and having me turn this thing into an affordable house, into an accessory dwelling unit for you. It's like, you've got to create the incentive, and then we have to figure out a way to hand that over to the people that make it happen in some way. And maybe part of this is for that. I don't know. I'm spitballing, but in other words, if we write the legislature without anybody knowing about it, it's just going to sit, right? We've got to get the word out in some way to people that can do that and make a difference with it, and go out and build these things. And maybe that's part of it. So make it actually happen.
I suggest I don't know if this is getting too far into the weeds, but I wanted to suggest maybe we go through each of these bullet points and just identify whether we're close to something or whether we need a lot more discussion.
I think that
and
sounds like a
decide
good
whether
plan.
we move them off for the moment, or if is that a agreeable way to proceed?
Sure.
On these last bullet points under H, so like kind of check off one by one. So for instance, I'm looking at the first one, and as I'm looking at it closer, and again, this is probably us getting into the weeds, but usually in my mind, loans are secured by a lien and forgivable at closing. Grants are usually not those two things. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think the issue there is, how do you ensure that it ends up an affordable unit, right? Because if you just give a grant, you still want it to end up being an affordable unit, an officially affordable unit.
Right.
So,
right, but I think the idea, again, maybe this is when do we get to the point where we toss this over to folks of the town to say what's doable? But in my mind, in order to secure that, in order to say it's forgivable first it's a loan, but you have to meet these criteria for it to be forgiven. So for instance, for it to be forgiven, you have to show that they will be affordable units. Now this is just for the design, so that's not all the way to an affordable unit. It's just a design.
In this, it's all coming back. In this part of the discussion, we did talk about, does the money come up front or does the money come at the end of the project? And there was some discussion about that, right?
Yes.
Remember that?
My brain is sparkling as you say that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Because there was some, and then it came to, well, all right, well, why are they going to, why am I going to ask for the money if I can already afford to do it? We got into a little bit of that, well, it's an incentive because you're going to get paid back for some of what you're doing. But that was sort of the outcome from that discussion, was really the only way to guarantee it and, to be able to monitor it and go and review it is if it's something you apply for after it's completed. But we also talked about the benefit of including some language where people who had existing ADUs could get legal, right, with this by offering the same type of some sort of grant reimbursement for whatever it is. So they could come to the town and apply for it and say, okay, I have an existing unit. Somebody from the town would have to go out and take a look at it and make sure it conforms, and then they would give them that same grant. So it was going to be for existing or new construction at one point in the discussion. That's not on the document, obviously. So I think this,
mixing things up, I thought that was more in the specific ADU conversations that we had, that this bled into that, but so for that first bullet point, I know the questions that we've raised, we need to figure out, the mechanism for and the logistics, for administering, those two things, for it to be secured by a lien and forgivable at closing, and monitor to make sure that at closing it is a affordable unit, right? So that's the question. Is there any other question in terms of language? Or am I wrong in thinking that we should put the language as a loan rather than as a grant? Because if it's a grant, in my mind, a grant is you don't pay it back. That's what a grant is.
yeah.
so that's, and that goes back to Christian's point about, do you give it after or in the process of it becoming an affordable unit, which I realize is not the same, for design, that's impossible.
Right.
But, is there, that's kind of what we're talking about in the second bullet in terms of the monitoring agent is an after, okay, you're turning this into an affordable and we'll help you overcome the cost of the monitoring agent. The design, I don't know. I don't even know what that runs. Does anybody have any idea what ADU design runs? Like, what are we even talking about money-wise with that? That's,
I don't know. That would be something we should know.
that's something that we had sort of talked
I
about.
think it really comes down to what type of ADU. Is it within the house? Is it something that is a minor change to an existing dwelling? Is it a completely different structure? If it's a completely different structure, does the design include the septic system? So I think there's pretty wide diversity on that one.
So do we cap those grants, or maybe we don't need to put that language in there, but do we? That's a question that I have.
Yeah, and regarding grant versus loan, I think Jeff years ago, he brought up that that opportunity for the town to look at Damon's, and he was explicit. They needed some upfront cash, and they needed to do an appraisal. And if the project worked, it worked. If it didn't, it wouldn't. And in that case, it's a true grant. So at some point we had talked about getting a head check, not just with staff, but with industry, to make sure that we're coming up with solutions to the real problems that they have. So my recollection, based on that specific project, is they needed that funding up front. They didn't have development money, so it was a true grant.
So we could change that language to loan, and we might want to then specify it's a loan, forgivable at closing, as it says, maybe no interest during the time that, unless it's not forgiven. Again, do we
Yeah,
need,
and then like who's servicing the loan? Like, you know, that's where things get sticky.
Are there different rules and regulations for a loan from a municipality? You know, for instance, there's all kinds of HMDA and RESPA and all sorts of stuff that federal government stuff that gets involved if you lend more than I think it's 8 instances. So like if I want to be a private lender and I start lending out money to people for private projects, mortgages, residential, I then have to register as a federal entity and I've got to go through all this stuff. And you know, now I'm talking about 100-page loan applications and that sort of stuff. Is it different for a town? Because this is also something potential that runs into the whole staffing part, the whole, okay, now we're a lender, right? Technically, unless it's different for municipal, you know, so there's a snowball effect here with the loan part of it. And again, I think that's where what Kenny's saying is I think we have to find out what that entails from somebody who might go, absolutely not. This is not something you could even talk about. So why are you even bothering, right? So that's a conversation that probably would need to be had with somebody inside the town.
or can you, I mean, maybe that's a very good question. Brian, we're hoping you're going to bring these questions back to the appropriate people. I guess I'm wondering, at least in the, you know, initial parts of this, I'm not anticipating these are large amounts of money. I'm not anticipating that, you know, any sort of percentage on a loan would yield very much. And so for, you know, versus the frustration of trying to actually administer that, I'm just wondering if the point is more about that the money is replenishing and not so much that it's, you know, with interest on it necessarily, in my mind. So it might be better to just say that it is a, you know, no interest loan, and then it's forgivable at closing. But if it's not forgiven, then it needs to be paid back. Is maybe that a way of avoiding some of the challenges?
I'm not familiar with the kinds of regulations that Chris is referring to, so I can't speak to that. If you wanted to do something that didn't involve trying to keep track of interest and you simply record a promissory note for the amount of the grant, you can certainly forgive that at any point in time as an organization. If you want to do that, you can release the note. And it would be up to you on, you know, if the project went south and they didn't do what they had intended to do, you can either expend money and try and enforce the promissory note, or you let the promissory note sit there until the property sells and then you get paid off at that point in time.
Right.
Clear the title.
That is definitely the much easier way to do
Yeah,
it.
that does sound simpler.
Right.
So you're gonna have a whole boatload of them out there, right? But
You know, assuming that it goes to a regular market rate sale and not a foreclosure or something like that, where you may lose the ability to collect behind a whole bunch of other priority lenders.
Right. You know, in that scenario, so are we getting to a place where we think we have something that I feel like if we say loan, but no interest loan secured by a lien, forgivable at closing on permanent finance of at closing on permanent financing for the design of accessory dwelling units. So
I think what you're really looking for is forgivable upon recording of a
affordable unit
restriction to make that low income housing.
Yep.
I mean, that's what you want in exchange for the money.
Yeah, so instead of saying forgivable at closing on permanent financing, forgivable at, how would we say it, proof of, an affordable unit.
A recording of
Even Ken?
deed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to cut out.
Okay. Thanks, Ken.
Take care.
Okay, so say that again, Brian. How would we say that? Forgivable at?
I'm not going to try and make it pretty, but you just forgivable when they record an appropriate commitment that the dwelling unit be used for affordable housing. So you're going to lock yourself into that mandatory 30-year state LMI classification.
Yep.
That's what, yeah, that's the, forgivable at the recording of the deed restriction, basically, right?
Okay. So that's good. So forgivable at recording of deed restriction on the unit. So shall we say, did folks agree, no interest loan rather than grant, and then the rest of the language, and then forgivable at recording of say
Deed
the rest
restriction.
of, the deed restriction on the unit.
I think that makes sense.
Okay. We've gotten through a bullet point, I think. So, and then the second bullet point seemed to be agreeable to everyone. No issues there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that one's just saying whether it's like Joe said, garage or, detached unit. It's basically saying it applies for either. So.
Right. And then the construction financing at whatever percentage for the building. So this is the building piece of it, not the design piece of it. So they could come back for additional financing. We could say the same thing. We could say that it's a no interest loan for the building of the accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how we pull this one off, just because.
Yeah, I'm inclined to nix it. I'm kind of in that camp right now.
Yeah,
I just don't know if we're anywhere near being able to pull this off. And we're already potentially saying we'll help with design and the monitoring agent, which I think is, those are decent grants to get that going.
I'm up for pulling that one out of there.
I guess I'm wondering what you feel is so far away for that one.
The amount that you would need for construction.
Fair enough. but I guess so that's what we're trying to do, is set things up that give us some ability to do things in the future. So as we grow, I mean, certainly it's something that we could add later on, but it might be something we want in there when we do have, are able to get more funding. And it doesn't, to me, it doesn't read so differently from the first bullet point that it couldn't be worked in a similar way. The real difference is that it's construction financing and not design. But I hear your point that it's, it's probably going to be a considerably larger amount of money for it to be worthwhile.
I mean, one project could wipe out the fund entirely.
Yeah.
Not even pay for the project, just depending on what it is.
But it wouldn't be so I think that's the other thing that's maybe not clear in this, that I don't think we would anticipate this fund being the full financing, that it would be some sort of other gap financing, right? That's in my mind, that's what this is about.
You might want to think of saying that you will finance, either for design or construction, a percentage not to exceed such and such an amount.
That's a good point.
So if you say, we'll finance 25% of your design costs not to exceed, $5,000 or $10,000, or we'll do 50% of your build costs not to exceed $20,000.
So the question there, I like that thought. The question there is, what's the percentage or dollar amount that gets over that gap? You know, what's the existing gap that's sort of needed to incentivize these types of projects? And you know, we want to make it so that there's enough that it would, right? Any thoughts on that?
I have no idea what that magic number would be.
Right.
That's a tough one.
Is that a knowable thing? Is that a, you know?
I don't think it is, only because it varies in size and scope. And again, I think what we're trying to do is just incentivize. We're probably incentivizing people that just about have the means to do this. Like we're not financing folks that don't have any money to build something like this. We're financing, hopefully making it worthwhile to someone that says, you know what, I got this garage and I've been thinking about this, and hey, look, you know, I can get $7,500 to help me get started, and I can get it from the town, and they're going to not charge me for it. You know, and I think that really should be the sort of the purpose of this.
Yeah, and they usually, so I'm familiar with like programs through Commerce RI where they make the language, they call it quote unquote but for language. So it means basically, you know, you couldn't do it unless you got this gas finance. You have to show some case where you couldn't just go out and get this elsewhere.
Yeah.
Now some of this too is you know, but maybe that's language that we can adopt as well. So have I at all persuaded you that with some modifications this is closer, or is this still something, Jen and Christian, that you feel like?
Oh, I think it's closer. No, I think it's closer. Yeah.
And I think if we have a not to exceed kind of number potentially on that too, I think that helps us hedge a little bit. With the...
Yeah, we don't want anything that's going to wipe out the fund in one go. And obviously,
if you're going to go with a not to exceed, you may want to go not to exceed per unit.
Yep.
So it's a different dollar amount for a 1 unit, 2 unit, 5 unit, 10 unit.
That's a good, not to exceed X amount per unit, you could say.
Yeah.
So going back to that question of how knowable is that gap, you know, there's someone who has an idea of, you know, what would be incentive enough and what would not. Not necessarily someone here, but is that a?
So our checklist right now for incentives is a 5-year, no, the tax abatement is for the length of the deed restriction, correct? For the affordables? That,
I believe that's the language you use.
I should read that. They just passed it on Tuesday.
Yep.
So you're not paying extra property taxes on it,
Yep.
right? Which is because it's affordable. And then you're getting a 0% loan to help with the design, potentially, if you need that, right? Like you may or may not need that.
Yep.
And then you're getting a certain amount towards the construction of the unit, not to exceed a certain amount is what we're kind of talking about here. We're actually giving people money. Is that what we're doing? Giving people money for the construction. This isn't a they pay us back.
No, it does say to be repaid, at least right now. The forgivable piece is the design.
Okay.
And I suspect that'll be a smaller amount. And that's why I think that's a good reason to do that as forgivable for the design, but repaid for the.
Can we simplify it and put the design and the construction part in as one, you know, to be given, you know, up to $7,500 forgivable, you know, once a deed is recorded, you know, for design and or construction costs, and just keep it simple, make it one element?
I was thinking the same thing, Christian.
Because I think we're getting too complicated, because there's the incentive, because Jen laid it out. So, and again, this is going to go to people that have some kind of interest in building something like this, and probably the means, who are going to say, great, I'm going to get a tax abatement for this sucker, and I can go to the town and get $7,500. I'm using that one because, of course, that's one of our other, that's in here somewhere else.
So it's almost like a rebate.
Yeah. Yeah, of a rebate, you know, once I make it affordable. I'm already planning on doing it because I want the tax break anyway. So, of great, I'm going to see this project through, and now I've got reimbursed $7,500, which is going to cover, you know, probably the plans and specs and maybe a little bit of the startup costs. And I get the tax abatement along with it. Simple.
Yeah, I think you have to understand that the market that you're targeting with this is probably somebody who's already inclined to do it, or at least create the dwelling unit, and you're just giving them a little bit of money to maybe get them look at making that dwelling unit affordable.
Yeah.
Because you don't have enough money to throw around to encourage people to build these things who weren't thinking of doing it already.
Right.
Right, it's the nudge. We're trying to do the nudge. Well, I'm in favor of trying to combine those two bullets into a.
There's language, it sounds like, in terms of a not to exceed X percent or X dollar amount per unit, right?
Yeah, that's the way I understand what you're talking about.
And then combining the two so that it's a similar mechanism, but it's for the design and or construction, or design or construction.
Yeah, and or, you know, just so they know it can kind of, it's really just, it's an initial, it's seed money. That's what it is.
Right. But we're saying at this point that it is forgivable. So it's not just, you know, it's not just gap financing. It's, you know, we wouldn't be getting that back.
Yeah, it's seed money that, assuming you follow the rules, you do not have to pay back.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So then the next bullet point, both of the above, that's pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of, you know, extending that to additional full-size units. And then the second to last bullet point, the one about the purchasing deed restrictions. What's thorny about that?
Well, we don't really have anything put together for that yet. Actually, that's our next discussion point. And I've got a bunch of research to talk about that I did since our last meeting on it. Got some pretty interesting information, including spoke to some town officials at a town in Massachusetts that tried to do this very unsuccessfully. and I'll tell you all why. I feel like that part should be removed because, again, I think we were putting that in because at the time this was something we were discussing. I think we're so far away from being able to implement that or even understanding if we can. And that's part of what I'll talk about with my discussion with the town folks.
Okay.
I would be for striking that.
Okay. Anyone opposed to striking that?
I'm fine with that
Okay.
for the same reasons.
Yeah, sounds good. So it sounds like bullet point 1 and bullet point 3 are being combined and adding in the language around not to exceed per a certain amount or percentage per unit, and then striking the 5th bullet point.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. So otherwise, we need to still, you know, the question is, as always, the question is, you know, the actual logistics of administering it, and we bring it back to the staff, the town, to help give guidance on that. But then the other open question is what that magic, you know, percentage or dollar amount that we put as a limit. How can we figure some of that out? Or do we just give a wild guess? And
Do we give it an amount and start there, knowing that we can adjust it down the line at some point? You know, I don't know. Joe, this might be more your forte, costs of construction and that sort of stuff.
I think realistically, you're given the limited amount that you have in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund right now, you almost have to start with your dollar cap and work back and think about, well, how many of these do I want to have money available to try and support? So say you have a goal of maybe trying to get 2 of these done within the next 12 months, and look at what you have in the budget and try and decide what you can feasibly support. Like I said, you're trying to nudge people who are curious, interested in supporting the idea of affordable housing. You're trying to, nudge them over the edge more than you are trying to get somebody who never thought about doing this at all to do it.
Yeah.
Do we? I'm looking at this and seeing that the catch-all language, the last bullet point, sort of seems to imply that any of these things that are listed out could go. We could go ahead and the Affordable Housing Collaborative could give the okay for it to be used in these ways, but anything else not specifically enumerated here, we'd have to go back to the town council for approval. Am I reading that right? Because it says
That's
other
correct.
financial.
So when I think about this dollar amount, I think there's mathematical ways that you can come up with an upper limit, right? So you could look at what is maybe a market rate rent versus a affordable, a low income rent, and you can look at how much would you have to discount the project so that they basically have the same return on investment for the investor. That would be the upper limit.
Yeah.
But with that said, I mean, ultimately, it's going to be how the market and how the builders respond. So that kind of points me more in a direction of, for those folks that are maybe familiar with the energy conservation program that the state has and the PUC, where the first year they came out and said, well, we'll pay for the distributed electricity at a rate of over 40 cents. And they sold out, right? They sold their maximum. So the next year they said 36 cents and then they sold out. And the following year was 32 cents and they sold out. Then last year it was 28.45 cents. And guess what? They didn't use the whole amount.
Right.
So this year it's 29.65. And I think, what I think you don't want to do is set it low and then you get no takers, and next year you're going to the town council trying to get money when you had no takers that year. I would almost err on the other side of going a little high, making sure you got some successes, and then have it so you're reevaluating on a year. So if you went high, you only were able to fund 2, but you got 10 applicants. Next year you go a little lower.
Well, the other
So
thing
that's one possible path.
The other thing you could do is, I mean, we're the ones imposing this not to exceed on ourselves. So the other way to do it is to not initially have that language in there, knowing that we don't have a lot of money in the fund, and knowing that we certainly want to make it go as far as we can. So we could leave that language out and see what comes and see what requests come for what amounts of money, and then determine what seems reasonable based on the requests that we're seeing, and add in language at some point if need be. That's another way of approaching it.
Do you think, then it's a negotiation a little bit more, right? Like, does it still function as a nudge if people aren't like, if we haven't planted the seed in their head, like, oh, I could get 7,500 if I deed restrict. I don't know. You think people would come in and say, well, if I was going to do this for, to just private market rent versus deed restrict, you think they're going to do the math and say, I think, for this to be worth it for me, I need X amount as a sort of rebate or to make it worth my time?
I think that somebody that's going to go out and take out a mortgage is probably going to make that calculation.
Okay.
I mean, I would.
Yeah.
That's all I get to go by.
So is the not to exceed a means of communicating, how much money they could get?
I guess I was, yeah, thinking of it almost as a little bit of a marketing thing. Like there's
Yeah.
this much money out there.
Right.
Um,
Versus, or versus if you just say, if you don't have a not to exceed, then people can just come make
mhm.
a request. And then we can say, you made a request for 200,000, you made a request for, whatever amount that we don't have. Well, we can't give you that, but this is what we could give you.
I guess that depends on how early it is in the process. I mean, builders want some, assurance, or they don't want a lot of risk. They want to know exactly this is how much it's going to cost me.
Right.
And if I'm going to go to the bank, I need to be able to tell them where the money is coming from.
Right. I'm just wondering, so I guess what I'm wondering is, for simplicity's sake, do we leave out the not to exceed and then let people know that there is a fund available and you can approach us and we can, discuss your project, and I don't know whether the town council or the town manager or anyone else is going to want that not to exceed, to put a limit on things, or whether we start it out by saying we know we have a modest amount, and that we're going to have a modest amount for the next year, unless we go out and really aggressively try and get more money in there. But my thought was only, could we simplify it and not have to figure out this magic number, and like you're saying, Joe, not go too low and then have no takers.
Yeah, I guess my point was that we could do math to figure out a amount that is the upper limit and is defendable.
Okay.
But it's all that. But that's really all it gives you, is a defendable argument. At the end of the day, you're going to have to go with what the market is responding to.
Sure.
So we're envisioning, most of these projects are going to be 1 bedrooms or 2 1 bedrooms.
Well, and we've said we could do it as an upper limit per unit. So if they're multiple units, then we can give more, as an upper limit. So Joe, would you be willing to take a crack at that math?
Well, I think we could. I can. We can just as easily as starting off with from some housing data. What's the market rate for a 2-bedroom? What's the market rate for a 1-bedroom? What is the maximum that we could do for an LMI for a 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom? What percentage is that? What's the difference in that percentage? That would be, let's say it's a difference of 30%. That's your upper limit, right? Unless you wanted to do something where you're looking at maybe some present value, but just simple percentages on the rent amount. That would be pretty straightforward.
But when you're looking at a unit and thinking about its payback, what's the timeline that you need?
Excuse me.
As far as coming up with some type of present value.
Yeah, exactly. So how many years do you need it to?
Yeah, you're gonna have to make some assumptions that you're gonna hold on to it. I guess it would be the 30 years, right? So at the end of 30 years, they're gonna have the same value because it's no longer gonna be restricted.
I see. Okay. So that starts to get to be, if it's 30 years and it's a 30% difference, or whatever percent difference it is.
You're right. It probably some type of present value would be a little bit better because at the end of 30 years they have the same value.
Right, but even still, that starts to get to be probably a pretty large number. What's the difference on an annual basis between market rate and affordable? Right, take that amount. Yeah. Now we're talking about, okay, we can do a present value function, but if I go out 30 years, that's even if it's a small amount, it starts adding up, right?
Yeah, but again, I think that this is only going to give you a starting point or a defendable upper limit.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
That's.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a doable.
I don't think our intent is to. Go ahead.
that makes sense to me. I think we can at least sort of, we don't have to necessarily show our math, but it makes sense to me in theory. Any other thoughts about that, or would it just be a wild guess for anyone else?
That sounds better than, yeah, my wild guessing.
Well, I think even if you, not necessarily you have to go with that number, but when you present whatever number you do, you can say, you know, this is what discount it would have to be to make it as a present value the same for the property. So it's a net wash for the builder.
Right.
And this is what we're proposing, which is somewhat less than that.
Right. Okay, so in order, it sounds like we've got most of the bullet points here worked out. This is sort of the besides the logistical, you know, administration and the questions around that, this is kind of the main question. So is there something that we can kind of figure out and propose between now and the next meeting? So in the next meeting, we can have something that we feel comfortable with. Joe, so I'll go back to you, Joe, if you would be willing to just sort of.
I'll try to break out those engineering economic books and see if I can try to build some, you know, present value and see what discount would be so they have the same present value.
There you go. Nice.
Yeah, good little
Or Joe, you could just make it up
task.
and
I
we wouldn't
haven't
know
done
the
that
difference.
stuff in a while.
and then Brian, between now and the next meeting, can we identify either who it is in the town? I guess maybe it goes back to John, but
Yeah, I can sit down and talk with some people, at least on the legal side of this, in terms of securing the loans, you know, pending forgiveness with the deed restriction, and see what's involved in that.
Mhm.
You know, up front, pretty much you're gonna come up with a boilerplate promissory note and an agreement that would apply to everybody, and then it's just a question of monitoring it and having a process to review when it's been fulfilled and a release.
Okay. So I think we've made good progress on this, and with those two items sort of ready for the next meeting, I think we're in a place where we could discuss and then potentially vote on it in the next meeting. Does that sound fair to everyone?
So are we is someone gonna just redraft the language that we discussed tonight so we can review that?
Yeah, I'll do my best at reformulating the language based on
Thank
what we
you.
talked about tonight.
Okay.
And I'm happy to take a look at it if you want.
Okay, I can circulate it around to you guys before the next meeting. You can certainly send your comments back to me. You can't talk to it amongst yourselves without violating open meetings provisions, but
Okay.
certainly everybody can comment to me.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, so I'll suggest that we move on to 6C, which is the discussion on the purchase of the deed restrictions. So Christian, you said you had some interesting findings. You want to update us on that?
Yeah, I did a bunch of research, i.e. Googling, and it just tried to find any information about, you know, any towns that were doing, you know, deed purchase programs for affordable housing, and couldn't find anything even close to it other than one specific town, and it's the town of Stowe, Mass, who actually had this exact program. I mean, to a T. I actually sent the document in today to try and get it circulated, but it was too late. But they've got a whole plan. It's exactly how to do it. In their case, just to give you a quick overview, they were paying $50,000 for the deeds to turn them into deed restrictions, and it was run by an organization called the Community Preservation Committee. It's kind of like a superpower committee, basically, made up of people from all the different departments. So I ended up emailing the town actually emailed the chairman of this committee, and a bunch of people got back to me and said they instituted this program in 2005 and were very excited about it, and the town was very excited about it. And then they ended up finding out that the state would not give them credit for the affordable units in this manner. And she said they went through a whole bunch to get this thing implemented and written, and they did meetings like this, and they did community, it was all part of their big community plan. And after all that work, nothing happened. So it sat on the books, and she said just in a meeting about 2 months ago, they ended up removing it. So what was also interesting, I have to find the other document here that I had brought up.
Did they state why the state? I'm sorry. Did they state why the state did not give them credit for those affordable units?
No, they didn't. They didn't say why, other than after reviewing the program, and it took the state some time to do that. They basically came back and said, "Oh, we're not going to count this." What's interesting about this town is they have a massive program. So they have a community preservation plan in place that they've had in place since the year 2000. And they set up this super committee called the Community Preservation Committee. And it includes somebody from, I'm actually reading the document here. It's got someone from the Open Space Committee, the Historical Commission, the Conservation Commission, the Council on Aging, which I thought was an interesting one, the Planning Board, the Board of Assessors, Affordable Housing, the Housing Authority, Recreation, and Finance Committees. And basically, so they've taken all these different committees like we have, and they've formed them into one giant committee who oversees this pretty massive plan. What they did in this town, which this deed restriction was part of, because it included a fund. So what they do with their fund is they included basically like a surcharge to property taxes, and they got the town to go along with it, which blew my mind, because obviously what's going on in our town right now, I couldn't imagine it actually happening. But it's a 3% surcharge in property taxes that's been going into this pretty large fund that oversees everything. I mean, it's open space purchases, it's, buying parks, it's buying dilapidated properties and fixing them up, it's fixing up historical properties and turning them into homes. I mean, the range and scope of what they're doing is incredible. And it's got all this document that I have. I'll actually send it to Brian so we can forward it over to you guys just to take a peek at. Shows the range and scope. It shows all the dollars that they've collected and spent on all these different projects. And Massachusetts actually will match up to 100% of that money. So it shows where, they've collected a 3% surcharge and they've gotten anywhere from 1, 2, or 3% in return from Massachusetts. So since 2001, when they implemented this, they've collected like $13 million.
Wow.
It currently, as of this October 2019, it has 4.5 million in it. Now, I also did, because I am a property tax sensitive person, did a quick search and looked at, what's a $400,000 house in South Kingstown got for property taxes versus Stowe, and I'll tell you, they're outrageous. So they're about $2,500 per home more than we are on, for every level of home, basically. So it's obviously added tremendously to their debt, to their property taxes. But pretty interesting nonetheless. But I thought it was nice that they got back to me. And that deed purchase program was a small part of it. But Brian, I will send you this document because it's got a lot of really interesting information to show how they've sort of been combined the historical side, the open space part, the affordable housing, sort of into one bucket essentially.
I'd be interested to see it. I mean, there may be some bits and pieces in it that are usable for us in South Kingstown in different respects. And just because it didn't work in Massachusetts doesn't mean it wouldn't work in Rhode Island. But given their experience, I think it would be pretty wise to run it by the state.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's the lesson right there. Yeah, and he even said that actually the planning board member that emailed me. There was actually two folks that were emailing me back and forth. It was the administrator of this group, and then the planning board chairman. He said the same thing. He said that it may be that the rules are different in Rhode Island, he said to us, it seemed like a great idea. It just didn't work, essentially. So,
But it sounds like it didn't work because they didn't give the state didn't go for it. Like otherwise, it could have potentially worked, or were they able to actually, like, did they go to the point where they purchased any deed restrictions, or they didn't even get to that point because it wasn't worth it? The state.
they didn't, because they didn't want to use their trust money to do it
Right.
if it wasn't going to count, because that was obviously the whole purpose of it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was really cool, and it reminds me also, and I think based on the language and the description that you're giving of that sort of mega kind of smart growth entity that they've got going on there, it reminds me of something that we had talked about. I found a while back and shared with Chelsea, and I think shared with the group. There was in Massachusetts, there was something called the Community Preservation Act that was passed, I don't know how many decades ago now, but it basically created, so there's a group in Massachusetts statewide called the Community Preservation Coalition, and then there's a bunch of money the state has bonded to put money into these community preservation things that, again, like you're saying, sort of combine elements of affordable housing, and historic preservation, and even like open space related stuff. So I bet that one of the reasons that they're able to have something that looks like that, and brings all those things together is some of that legislation. So
That's actually paragraph 1, page 2 after it talks about the Community Preservation Act. That was the catalyst for them to create this group. And that's where they're actually the ones that are refunding the money. That's where the match comes from that community.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's another thing to, I mean, we're obviously facing a budget shortfall this year and likely next year from the state, but in any case,
Yeah, let's push the housing bond first at the state level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Call everyone you know. Let's get
Yeah.
that housing bond on the ballot.
So, but very cool.
I'll email this over to Brian for distribution. It's an interesting read if nothing else. But that was the only case I could find specifically with deed restriction. I will tell you, when you start Googling all this stuff, I mean, there's a ton of resources out there, all sorts of case studies from some pretty interesting town projects. Portland, Oregon, there's a ton of stuff, ton of affordable housing initiatives going on in Portland. And just interesting to read how they're doing them. Really nothing that pertained to anything we were looking up at this time, but it's well worth, a night of a couple of hours of Googling if you have a chance at some point.
Christian makes a point. The Pacific Northwest right now is off the hook in terms of affordability. So I'm sure there's a lot of really creative, interesting things going on out there right now.
So for the purposes of sort of moving the discussion forward, that's really great research, Christian, and really appreciate it. And so it sounds like the next step is to try to engage the state proactively and get a sense of whether they would go for this type of a program, purchase of LMI deed restrictions. Any thoughts on who that would be that we would engage at the state to?
I can make some calls on that and see what people have to say about that concept.
Okay.
Okay.
That sounds great. Anything else on this agenda item?
I think we hold off till we find out what's going on, and then take it from there.
Okay. So next on the agenda is an update from the planning department staff. Brian?
The only thing I was going to mention is what Jen brought up a couple of times. The first segment of the South Kingstown Homestyle project got approved by the planning department this week and will be headed on to the town council. I think it might make Monday's agenda. I think that's what we were trying to do. We certainly got all the changes and everything ready for them to take it up. So I would check the website tomorrow for the council's agenda and see if it's on, if you're interested in monitoring the Zoom meeting on Monday.
Oh, cool.
Awesome. So then we've got the next meeting date as Thursday, October 22nd at 7. And do we need to, I guess we'll vote then on when we want to have our
Yeah,
meetings.
because you don't have enough people to vote right now,
Yeah.
but at least bear in mind, we need to have dates for November and December, or pick one date to cover the 2 months, or skip the 2 months until January. Whatever you guys want to do works.
And in between is an appealing idea because I feel like we always have trouble getting everybody together. If we could find a date in between, I'll just throw that out there. After Thanksgiving, I guess.
Yeah.
Not that we're all traveling.
Yeah.
I'm going to change my Zoom backgrounds.
You know, without having to compete for conference room space, and
Yeah, it's a little easier.
planning now having its own Zoom account for its own meetings, you've got a lot of flexibility in dates. So
Without voting on it, but just a quick discussion to put it out there. If we did a meeting on the Thursday prior to our meetings, our usual meetings, so that would be November 19th and or December 17th. I guess 17th is getting pretty dang close to holiday time. But does that strike folks as potentially doable, or do we want to try that sort of in between idea?
The 17th in December is probably going to be an issue for me because we're so slammed right around that time for the Johnny Cake stuff that we do. So I might just be working 12-hour days. The November I could do for sure.
So maybe a December 10th to not be, although that gets, you're right. I mean, at that point, we'd have one on the November 19th. Is that, am I looking at that right?
if you want to split the difference and do one meeting between the 2 months, December 3rd or 10th are both open in the sense that I don't have any other meeting commitments those nights.
Okay.
The 3rd, 10th, and the 17th are all clear, as is November 19th, at least in terms of my evening meetings.
Okay.
And you're not locked into a Thursday night either, so.
Right. It just tends to work for folks. Okay. Well, I mean, we can't vote on it anyway, so we've got some options and we'll discuss it next time.
I can circulate an email. There's nothing wrong with polling members on scheduling issues electronically. They don't view that as being a violation of the Open Meetings Act. So what I can do is I can throw a bunch of these dates into an email and circulate it to everybody tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
So I just, before we have a motion to adjourn, if I could just, for my sake, quickly go back and through who's doing what between now and the next meeting to make sure we're moving all the discussions forward. So we've got to, if we're hoping we would get the tax assessor to come to our next meeting again, is that true?
Yes.
Okay, so Brian, you'll talk to John about that. And then the proposed changes for the Affordable Housing Trust, you're going to draft some of the language, change the draft for some of the language we talked about and circulate it around. We can have a one-way or a discussion with you, but not among ourselves.
Yeah.
And then, so really we've just put a bunch on your plate, Brian, because you're also going to, also going to be.
The last thing I was going to look into were the mechanics of a promissory note and
that's right.
For securing the loan, at least temporarily.
That's right. And then also talking to whomever is the appropriate person at the state around just floating the idea of the
MID.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll scratch around and see if I can get an answer to that.
Okay, so those 4 things that we put on your plate. we appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we've been efficient tonight and gotten a lot done, so that's awesome. We have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Any opposed? Let's do it.
That'll do it.
All
Have
right.
a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Nice to see you.
Thanks,
Bye now.
guys.
Have a good night, everybody.